Hello, everyone. It's 8:30, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. As long as I can bring my panelists under control. All right, you guys. Jean, Kevin, we're going to start. I can tell we're going to have an engaged panel. At least they're going to be very interested in exchanging some thoughts with each other, which will be great. And the goal here is for you guys to jump in too in about the halfway mark. We're gonna create an opportunity for some comments first, and then get some discussion going, we hope. The goal here was to bring together, you've heard from lots of different people in the dental space who have a track record of successfully innovating and bringing change of behavior products to this market. It's not for the faint of heart. It's a different process often than people have been exposed to through medical device or pharmaceutical companies. So we're kind of, especially for those of you who are clearly headed into the mainstream dental market, but even craniomaxillofacial, I think there's a lot of value in understanding from people who have experience successfully innovating here. So that's what we're going to do today. And we've tried to kind of bring in panelists who represent a range of experiences along that translational process, from more early discovery innovations. Kevin Bird is here, who's the senior manager of the Lab of Oral and Craniofacial Innovations at the ADA SRI. Kevin has some really interesting innovative ideas also about preclinical work, which I think will be highly relevant for this group. Likewise, Vicki Rosen is a scientist who has innovated from the discovery phase. She was instrumental in the discovery phase at Genetics Institute with BMP, taking that all the way through clinical trials and translating that to a product that was then carried by a different company. She's now a professor of developmental biology and chair of that department at Harvard School of Dental Medicine. But we'll speak about her experience in this space, innovating and bringing a major change of behavior, the first true biologic, even if it was regulated then as a device. Steve Cornelius, who's CEO, and Jean Dorff, who's CEO, are both bringing a business perspective. Steve's at a company called Bioelectrics right now, which is developing a periodontal innovation involving light and well, you can talk, not light, electricity, whatever the name. But he actually also has, for our endo projects, a long experience bringing major change of behavior to the endodontic space when he was at Dentsply. So lots of innovations that he was involved in launching and building very successfully there. And likewise, Jean Dorff is CEO of a company called Somatex now. I met Jean when he was at J&J and had just licensed in Aura Pharma, so one of the first big drugs in this periodontal space. And he then went on to bring in Datum as a regenerative product, actually twice. I think both at J&J he acquired it, and then he had the opportunity to acquire it again at Dentsply. That's a story in itself. Yeah, the second time was much better. And Jean has a lot of experience in a broad array of dental specialties and the general dental market, which is relevant for some of you as well in bringing innovation successfully to market. So that's who's on our panel. I've asked each of them to give just 5 minutes, not a long overview of some highlights of their experience and lessons learned, and then we'll open it up to discussion and questions from all of you if you'd like to hear anything more from them. So I think I'm going to start at the end where Steve is sitting, and take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Jeannie. Can you hear me okay out there? Great. So I'm Steve Cornelius. I'm CEO of Bioelectrics. I've been in the dental industry on the business side since about 1996. And that's the year that Dentsply bought a little startup company called Tulsa Dental. And excuse me, at the time, rotary instrumentation for root canals was barely unheard of. And the standard of care was using stainless steel K-files that dentists would pre-bend in the shape that they thought was a root canal and go in and instrument the canal. And it was done that way for 60, 70 years. and the people that started Tulsa Dental, along with some KOLs, some important KOLs, completely changed how root canals were done. So I was very fortunate. My first gig in dentistry was to completely change how a medical or dental procedure was performed. And I just had dinner last night with one of the sales reps here in Pittsburgh that I hired back in '97. And when we get together, it's like we've been together for the last 20, 30 years. It was that kind of culture and that kind of environment. So when you really do change something, the relationships that you make during that period are lifelong relationships. And, you know, the money was there, the achievement, the awards, all the, you know, all the big things that go along with success in business, all there. But it's the relationships that probably matter after these number of years. So after that, I was there for 4.5 years, I think. Prior to this, I was in consumer packaging, had nothing to do with medical devices, nothing to do with dentistry. So that was my first time in the dental industry. After Tulsa Dental, they sent me up to Toronto, where I ran Dentsply Canada for 5 years. So I went from very narrow focus on root canals to just about everything Dentsply manufactured for an entire country. Now, granted, it's Canada, so it's smaller, but it went from a very narrow focus of dentistry to very broad. So that was a little bit of career whiplash, also assimilating into another culture. Toronto's a great town, loved it there. My kids grew up in schools where they were amongst a very diverse culture. So a lot of folks from China were there, a lot of folks from India were there. So it was great for our family. And from a business perspective, it really gave me the kind of the larger viewpoint of dentistry. Because if you run anything for Dentsply, they basically play in every facet of dentistry. So it went from very narrow focus in root canals to very broad focus. And then for my last 5 years with the company, I repatriated back to York, Pennsylvania, and ran their professional division, which you guys are probably more familiar with the brand names Cavitron, Midwest. What else did we have? Basically everything hygiene, everything preventive, and that was a worldwide business. So that was my career with Dentsply as I decided to move back to Cleveland, which is my hometown. And those of you from Pittsburgh, I apologize, I guess. I'm a big Browns fan. I met a company called Bioelectrics that was basically a patent and an idea at the time. And we've taken it through 2 in-human clinical studies. We're currently preparing our de novo submission for the FDA and heading into another 3rd pivotal study with the McGuire Institute, with Jeannie's help, coming in the next few months. And we intend to use that study to provide the FDA the final clinical efficacy data to get to market. So I went from the largest dental company in the world, Dentsply, to the smallest, which is a startup. So there was some additional whiplash involved in there. But I guess the thing I'd close with, and I'll pass on the mic, is I love innovation in dentistry. I love figuring out how a technology or a scientific idea or an engineering improvement in something can make the practice work better so they can actually adopt it so it can help the patient. And it's important to understand those 2 steps, right? First, you got to get the dentist practice to understand how to implement it and bring it into their protocol before it can even benefit the patient. So I'm happy to answer any questions as we get further down into this presentation on how that's been done. But I'm really grateful to be here this morning, and thanks, Jeannie, for the invite.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. As you can see, rich experience innovating here. And now we will turn it over to Vicki Rosen.
So good morning, everyone. So when I started my career, I left a postdoc and went to this startup company called Genetics Institute, which was started by 2 Harvard professors, Tom Aniatis and Mark Patashny. And it was all based on cloning, being able to clone genes and express proteins. And we had this idea that because we could do that, they would be drugs. Now, we had no idea what a drug, how you got to make a drug, but we knew we could make these proteins. And the experience at the company was really all about making these proteins, cloning these genes, making these proteins, and then somehow the rest of it would get figured out and we would make money. So, we were a startup, we weren't public, we raised a lot of venture capital, and along with sort of figuring out BMP and doing the cloning and expression and stuff, one of the parts of my job, and I actually really thought it was a lot of fun, is I went on these, we would call them these little road shows where we went to venture firms and gave them our spiel about how we were going to change medicine and raised money, and we were pretty successful at that. And so after about 2 years at Genetics Institute, we had cloned this gene family, the beginning of the gene family, and BMP2 was called BMP2 because it was the second of the genes we cloned from this group of genes. And then we were faced with the fact that what was our product going to be? And one of the problems for us was that there was no market. So everybody knew that if you could make bone grow better or fix it, that would be a really good thing. But no, there wasn't any drug on the market that actually did that. And there weren't any recombinant proteins that were actually approved to do that. So there was no model. And as we went out and talked to who we thought our customer would be, orthopedic surgeons, they didn't really like the idea very much because they were very successful at doing orthopedic surgery the way they always did it. So we had a lot of, surprisingly, we had a lot of pushback about why would we want to do this? And it took us a pretty long time to sort of figure out an approach. And the other thing that I think I can say pretty clearly is we made every possible mistake. And we made all those mistakes, I think, in part because we were very confident in who we were as scientists, but we didn't have an appreciation for what happens when you have to translate the science into a product. We just thought, oh yeah, people sell it, everybody will use it, delivery, I mean, what do you mean? You'll just, and the other recombinant proteins that we were at that time working on were things that were injectables. So things you may have heard of, erythropoietin, GM-CSF, M-CSF, various other stem cell factors. Factor VIII was one of our first products. And those you could just inject. And people had this idea, well, okay, well, then the way you make growth factor products is you just inject them. So I think probably many of you have experience with trying to inject BMP2. And if you can find it after you inject it, that's pretty great, but it doesn't really do very much, right, when you deliver it that way. So we had a whole series of failures in trying to figure out how to create a product. And the product that we eventually got approved, and that was also an issue because the FDA had never approved a biological like this before. And as you might know, we got approved as a device, which seems illogical, but nevertheless, that's what the FDA wanted to classify it as when we went to them. And so the product, the original BMP2 product, is not a perfect product by any means. There was such a huge learning curve in trying to figure this out. And one of the things I've appreciated so much since I've been involved with this group is the fact that there is a lot of fantastic expertise out there for you to take your idea and your innovation and talk to people and work with them and get help to really define your product, your market, the best uses, how you're going to approach the FDA. This is probably something that a scientist probably shouldn't say, but I almost think all the downstream stuff is more important than having your scientific discovery. Because if you can't translate it, it's a great science paper, so we published our original Cloning in Science, but it wouldn't have helped anyone unless we were able to translate it. So this translational ability, the knowledge base that's here to do that is really fantastic. And I've, looked back now on places where it would have helped me so much. And so I think taking advantage of that is enormous. And my hat's off to NIDCR for funding this, because I think that is truly innovative and truly forward thinking. And I'm not funded by NIDCR, so there's no conflict of interest. But, and so the other thing I would say is, people always ask me about my career, and I moved from biotech back to academia, and that was not because I don't think working at biotech or working in industry is valuable. I really do, but it was the right thing for me to do for personal reasons at that time in my life. And I've had a wonderful second part of my career, but it's really all been based on what I did at biotech. And I will leave it there.
Great story to tell. So Kevin Hurd is going to be our next panelist, and Kevin can give us a little, he's newer to the Resource Center, so we're excited to have you here for the first time. So
yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so a bit about my career. My original goal after graduating from Michigan with my DDS was to get down to some program that would allow me to combine both a PhD and also residency training. And during that time, I had the idea when I was there, because UNC had a very flexible program, that I would leave the School of Dentistry and go find technologies that I could bring back to dentistry. Actually, it was a source gathering mission. And so while there were incredible and innovative researchers at UNC at the time, I actually joined the lab of a very new PI. He was in the medical school, it was his first trainee, but he had that access to technologies, but also the brain trust of stem cell biologists from Rockefeller and people that had trained him and her, actually going back to days of Howard Green that cultured the very first human cells in the 1980s and late 70s. And so for me, it became this gathering mission of what was out there. And so I kind of essentially a big deep dive into zebrafish, Drosophila, moving into developmental biology and then to adult stem cell biology, and continuing to ask questions. And this delayed my residency a bit because I was funded by NIDCR to keep doing this work on stem cells in the oral cavity. And at the same time, I think reading very broadly. It was something that we pushed ourselves as graduate students and as postdocs to do. And there was a paper that became very impactful for me that will set up, I think, the story of what we're doing now. It was in 2016, I was, again, at the bench just reading papers. And there was this publication that came out as a white paper as part of this Human Cell Atlas initiative, which I thought, well, okay, that sounds really interesting. And the way in which they sold this white paper was that it was going to be essentially an update to the Human Genome Project, but at the individual cell level. So if there are 40 trillion cells in the human body, they were going to find and map all of them, find how they might deviate in disease states and development and aging, and essentially construct this map as a way to start to predict how things might be targeted, things that could be useful in translational research. And so my lab mate at the time, I looked at her and I said, this scientist, I know you trained at MIT in Broad, is she approachable? And she looked at me and said, you'll never speak to her. Her lab is 70 scientists wide. She's not available for contact. And so I said, okay, I'll take that as a challenge. And I sat back and did not actually send that email, but just planted a seed and wrote the grants that I was hoping to get funded, which eventually did to do the first single cell analyses in the oral cavity, which we got funded to do in 2018 by a very forward-thinking grant from Sunstar, which was industry at the time, as a combination with the American Academy of Periodontology. And so as a mouse biologist, I wrote my own IRB, conducted the surgeries, did the flow cytometry, did the analyses, the sequencing, and kind of just as a one-man show to see if we could get to work. At that time, I had joined clinic, and I was wondering how it is we could use this data to make an impact because it was very small. Just as reference, at the time, it was really exciting. The single cell field was nascent, and there was a new technology out that we could actually sequence 800 cells at the same time. I will tell you today, we can easily sequence millions. And so that's over a period of just about 5 years. And so the scalability and the interpretability of these assays are really phenomenal. And so we had this data, we're getting excited, we're gonna analyze it, we're gonna publish, and then the pandemic happens. And so I'm at home with our whole team has kind of been decimated. The cores that I was using weren't available. And so I sat back and I kind of thought as the pandemic starts to become more evolved, that somebody needs this data. So the leaders of the Human Atlas I can find them by email. So I wrote an email and said, I have this data, I have nothing to do with it. Do you want to, maybe that the ACE receptors and other things important for biology are there, and you can just use it. And she writes back and says, immediately, within 5 minutes, she says, let's write this together. Let's scale this and do this the right way. And so that set off a journey of how it is that we have now assembled a team with Sarah Teichman, one of the leaders of the HCA, and 65 other labs across 5 continents, which I have individually contacted via Zoom to build out a loose collaborative network so that we, across pulmonologists, gastroenterologists, computational scientists, and a whole host of specialties within dentistry, are trying to build the first reference map in just healthy adults of the oral cavity. And you might think, well, why is that relevant? Well, because there's already papers in other body systems that are not only integrating this data, they're also using it as a way to, let's say, algorithms like drug to cell, where they can predict using the Chembl database with the millions of compounds that exist, which individual cells of the heart are going to respond in adults to a simple therapeutic. This becomes really relevant if you think about, for example, atlases might include all the cells representative of a fetus. Maybe you could predict whether certain drugs that are being developed and the kind of their predicted targets, whether or not that those would be safe for maternal use. And obviously, as you start thinking about off-target effects in the oral cavity and other spaces, having the oral cavity at the table is incredibly important for integration. So while in the original data sets, and we're thinking about new ways to innovate here for how we can use in vitro models to start to predict perturbations and scale, one of the interesting things that has been relevant is thinking about the ways in which that the integration is also really important. So the Human Atlas had 0 single-cell data sets of any oral. This is all RNA first back in 2020. And then since we've collected with us in this group, we're up to now about 500,000 cells representing pretty much every cell type, as well as some brand new ones that we're still trying to understand what do they do and are they relevant. And so I wondered if this was useful. The conversations that I had yesterday with Araxis became very important. Conversations that I've had with Isabel have been very important. And there's ways in which that these reference atlases can inform some of the studies even being done here today. And so the ADA has been incredibly supportive of this work. It's continuing to be at scale, but I just want to highlight that it's because of a very, very collaborative research network that we built, that hopefully these innovations get us closer and hopefully de-risk some of the studies that we're thinking about to hopefully make us more impactful in clinic.
So again, innovation here within even the context of how we do some of our development and preclinical work, which is very exciting. Now we're going to go back to the business side again, where Gene's actually brought in a lot of very innovative products, and many of you I know are at that stage where you're looking for a partner like a Gene to help you with that. So talk about innovation from that perspective.
So the business people are sandwiching the science people
Yes.
in this conversation. So thank you, Jeannie. For those of you, I've met many of you in the past, but for those of you that may not know me, my entire professional background has been in healthcare. I started my career at Johnson & Johnson, spent 12 years leading the sales for Tylenol. Think about 12 years selling 500 milligrams of acetaminophen tablets. You think it gets boring, but I did that. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it, but that really gave me a tremendous foundation that I think serves me well today in helping all of you as you're trying to bring your projects to market. I've been in the dental industry for 20 years. I entered the dental industry working for Johnson & Johnson, what they viewed as white space. Many of you may remember Johnson & Johnson was deep in the dental industry in the 80s and 90s and decided to exit the dental industry when they didn't see it as a growth area in the very early 90s. And then 10 or 15 years later, they decided to come back in, and they had very, very large ambitions to be in the dental industry. At that time, I was working in the business development group. We acquired a company called Aura Pharma, and I eventually wound up in one of the leadership positions of that company and started my career in dentistry. progressed to Dentsply Sirona, and over the time, I've worked with products that have been specialty products. I've worked with products with general dentist. I've worked in both the United States and Europe, also a little bit in Asia, but specifically in the US and Europe, and developed a very good sense for bringing products to market. My area of expertise is really commercialization and business development. And so over the past few years during COVID, brought a very large implant product line, through FDA and obtained approval, as well as MDR approval, in Europe. And then prior to that, a number of general dentist products, as well as pharmaceutical products. Acquired what is Datum Biosciences, the Ossex brand. I've had the distinction of doing that twice. I acquired that business once when I was at Johnson & Johnson and brought it to market in the United States as both a dental product and as a cosmetic dermatology product. And then that company, there's some issues there, production failures. Johnson & Johnson divested that. It went back to its founders, and lo and behold, they found me again. And I bought the business back from them again with Dentsply when I was at Dentsply Sirona. So very space that's probably near and dear to what a lot of you are working on today. And so it's been great. A great run. I thoroughly enjoy the dental industry and what we're doing here as compared to what I view as a hardcore medical device sector. And I think that some of you have had experience when you're talking about what I call large medical device, hospital, medical surgical products, tremendous opportunities there, but also very big markets dominated by large companies and large research projects. And sometimes it's hard to feel your own personal impact, whereas I feel that all of us here have a personal impact on the dental industry. So
Great, thank
yeah,
you.
so
Thank you,
you.
Gene. Thank you, everyone. So laying that foundation, you have some sense for what kind of expertise we have here, quite a range of experiences to draw from. So I'd like to open it up for questions, things you'd like to understand better from individual panelists or from the panel as a whole. And I think Patrick is going to be carrying one of these microphones around, so if anybody wants to get started. Anybody have okay, Robbie, thanks.
Good morning. So we hear quite a bit that many startups will pivot during the course of their tenure. I'm curious your comments on, as an entrepreneur, when you see an opportunity, how to understand if it's truly an opportunity or just a distraction. Because you're just faced with so many things that perhaps you want to go away from your core because this represents something big, or maybe it doesn't. And I'm just curious your experience from that standpoint.
Who wants to tackle that one? It's kind of
Yeah. Thanks, Robbie. So my formative experience I mentioned a moment ago was working in the Tylenol business. We used to ask ourselves one question, and a very successful executive in the company used to ask us all the time, and it was continuous. What problem are you solving for the patient? What problem are you solving for the patient? And he did that because every time he would ask, he was trying to get us to dial down to be even more and more crisp each time to talk about what the product benefit was going to be to the patient, because that ultimately led to what your clinical claims would be and what your marketing claims would be. And so you see a lot of technologies, and I think you probably have one that could go in a lot of different directions, and it will. I'm sure it will, but at some point you need to pick something and just say, this is it, and we're going to focus on, because you want to accomplish something. You can't be all, you might be able to be all things to everyone at some point in time, but to get yourself to that point, you got to get yourself out the door. And so, and we learned this at Aura Pharma. We had grand visions for Reston when we launched that product, but we couldn't. Everything we wanted to do with Reston, we couldn't do in our clinical trial. And so we had to be very, very focused and very, very narrow. And it started with understanding, what is it we're going to solve for the patient? And then we backed from that into saying, okay, what will be the clinical claims? ultimately leading to some marketing claims, but we were able to build the business around that. And so it's picking that, understanding it, and truly staying the course. And all those other distractions are out there. You have to push them aside, because once you start to have success, the other distractions can become reality down the road. But you got to get that first product to market, even if it's narrow. You want to establish that success, and you want to establish a process of getting there. I mean, that's very important too. So,
Any other comments? Steve wants to talk about it.
Yeah, first of all, I totally agree with Gene. It all comes down to, what are you trying to do for the patient? I heard the question slightly differently, and our device right now is we're positioning it as a treatment for periodontal disease. Our technology can do many things in the oral cavity, but I look at it as, and we're faced with this all the time as we navigate our way through the FDA. And I look at it simply, it's a probability of success times size of opportunity. And it sounds really simple, right? I always think about it. I think I bought one lottery ticket in my life. But to me, it's like, would you buy $1 million lottery ticket for $1 if you had a 50-50 chance? Of course you would, right? So I always look at things like that when I'm trying to decide, do we go after this claim? Do we go after that claim? Do we go after that market? And it's literally, you got to lay out your probability of success. Hopefully that's high, times the market size of the opportunity. And from a business perspective, that's how we make early stage decisions on what kind of claims or what kind of markets we're chasing. And everybody's going to have a different probability of success calculation, different perspective maybe on it. And then everybody's chasing after a different size of the market, depending on what your technology can accomplish clinically.
Thanks, Steve. And Vicki, why don't you speak to this too? Because I think the platform that you were working with had to stay focused, probably required quite a bit of discipline.
Yeah, without focus, we're dead.
Yeah, so
It's that simple.
actually, I was thinking about that as you were speaking. So, for BMPs, as an example, every cell in your body has a BMP receptor. So it can do many different things. Deciding which is most important to you or most important to the patient, or in some companies, most important to the bottom line, is not an easy decision to make. And as a scientist, I probably make a different decision than the person who's looking at the bottom line. So for me, the importance is when there isn't a solution to a problem, this is a new solution, or the ability to start a solution, as opposed to a problem that already has an okay solution, having a better solution. And sometimes a better solution is a bigger market than a novel solution in terms of rare diseases and things like that. But for me as a scientist, my focus would be on the novel and the thing that is going to have the biggest impact where there is no impact now. It's not a great business decision.
Yeah, it can be. Kevin, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I can say one thing about that. So when it comes to, I think, finding a space to make an impact, I feel like in oral health, it's always been pushed on us that we find a way to use some of these tools that we have to solve a problem. And I think oftentimes the commercial angle at the end tends to be a focus on maybe the most common diseases. But one of the things that we have now with some of our single, and I could also talk about this in another space, about our spatial biology, is that we can walk away with a single slide from a patient, as long as we have a biopsy, in pretty much any biobank in the world, and it could be the rarest disease on the planet. And we could pretty much profile and find targets that eventually partner with, because we're not going to do the drug development, of finding targets that can be impactful for that. I think the hardest part for us right now is if we have this toolkit and there's so few of us in this space, what's going to be the most utilitarian goal that gets us to some commercial output that makes the most impact? And I find that we have that challenge. And so I think to that question, we're still in that searching phase. We spent time on perio and spent time thinking about how to make an impact in that space. But it is just as attractive to start thinking about, there's many ways that periodontal disease can manifest, systemic ways that it can break down the site that don't have anything to do with the traditional dysbiosis that breaks down the kind of host defenses. And so we could just as much make an impact on, rare craniofacial and genetic diseases the same way that the kind of traditional model is. It may not have the impact, and so we're always at that place where we built this toolkit that I could probably focus and say, commercial only, applied genomics, and let's go this direction. But at the same time, we're also debating, should we also be a discovery lab that then props up others to then continue to discover? And it's a philosophical debate we have in the lab. I would tell you that my senior director is always asking me to become more focused, and he's not wrong. And I think that divide is that we want to make the most impact, but we're still gathering information.
Yep. And I think the bigger your technology platform, the more challenging it is to find focus. I mean, even to focus on dental versus other medical indications for some of you. I know there's always challenges there. Any other questions from the group? So, Will?
So thanks to each one of you for these nice overviews and hearing about your own story and innovation. And so, one of the questions that I was going to ask as a part of this group, thinking about the consortium and how it was developed to really take new technologies and pair them up with clinical needs to then advance, dental medicine, these new technologies. And then eventually, and I think we've had a big support from the avenues as well, looking at how can we get these new technologies clinically adopted. And I think that, Gene, you mentioned it before, that you really enjoy being in this space in dentistry, this smaller field where you're able to have a lot of impacts. But we've also realized that through the Food and Drug Administration with new technologies, it's very difficult to break through into dentistry. And when we started talking about this new grant program that the NIDCR has, really had that vision to fund, as many people in the third-party payer environment would, just tell us, this is going to be so difficult for you to move the needle, is going to be a challenge to get these new technologies into the marketplace. And so what are some of your insights, in terms of our group, because this is a group of dreamers looking at these new innovations to bring them into the clinic, and then, not getting too distracted from the bigger medical indications and how we can work in this wheelhouse of, advancing oral health care?
It's a great question. So, Gene, you want to tackle that one first too, or?
It's a big question, Will.
Yeah.
When you look at this space, it pales in comparison to the size of medical, and the payer model is completely different, right? A lot of times when, my experience in working in pharma, you create a drug, and as you're creating the drug, you're thinking about payer strategy. You have these development teams, and there's science people and there are business people, and all these things are happening in parallel. You're thinking about developing the drug and what it could be, and then you're also thinking about the reimbursement model and how it's going to get paid for it. It's really well thought out, and there's a lot of track that's laid out there, and I think that model requires that. But at least in the United States in particular, dentistry still tends to be more of an owner-operator type model. Yes, we have DSOs and we have dental insurance, but all the costs are largely borne by the dentist, and they're reimbursed in insurance for the services at the rate that the payers are willing to reimburse them, and the dentist makes their living off of between what their expenses are and what they're reimbursed, and what's left over is more or less for them. And so they're not ready. Dentists are not going to adopt a product that's a great technology if it's significantly more expensive. if it's going to drive up the cost of doing a procedure, and if an implant therapy, for discussion's sake, is $5,000, and you're going to add $500 to the cost of that therapy, it's going to be a challenge. If you're going to have $500 in cost of that, it's going to be a challenge. And so I just point that out because as you come to market, sometimes new therapies are expensive, and you want to understand what the cost of your therapy may be down the road, because there may be economies of scale, there may be different manufacturing technologies that can be employed, and so on and so forth, that will eventually bring the price of something down. But if you're going to bring something to market that is going to directly impact a dentist's income, you really need to have a very, very strong and compelling case for that. Because I think, as Vicki indicated with orthopedic surgeons, orthopedic surgeons look at things and say, I've been practicing this procedure on patients for X number of years, and they're all fine. They're doing well. They leave surgery and they get home and they walk, and life is good. So you're now asking me to change my procedure, maybe add a new product or whatever, and I don't know if that's going to result in necessarily a better outcome. Now, they don't have as many economic considerations as dentists would. The dentists say, well, I don't know if it's going to result in a better outcome, but also of importance, although some might say more importantly, is this going to cost me more to provide this therapy? And that's a big factor. And I think we've all seen some products in this industry that are great products that have been introduced, but they're just too costly for dentistry.
So Steve, why don't you talk about your experience with the Cavitron? Because again, change of behavior, adding a different cost to a practice, and yet adopted. So kind of how did that value translation happen?
Yeah, so first, cost is obviously important, but I'll tell you an anecdotal story. At Tulsa Dental, when we came out with rotary instrumentation, basically we got dentists to do something they were told never to do in dental school, which was take a rotary instrument into a canal. They were told to take a K file, pre-bend it, and because of the technology of nickel titanium files that had a memory and were bendable and didn't have cutting edges, we were able to get them to do that. That was the easy part. The harder part was we were charging $5, 5 times the cost of a K file for every one of our files. So the concept of paying more for something is a real thing. And the way we overcame it, the way I know to overcome it, is you gotta, it's not the cost, it's the profitability. And in our case, we took a three-rooted molar root canal for maybe 2 visits and maybe 2.5, 3 hours, down to 45 minutes, 1 visit. So they were more than happy to pay 5 times for our product. But it had to affect them economically, and the way we did it was in chair time savings. And if you think about the biggest cost in a dental practice, it's literally the clinician's time. So if you can save them time, allow them to charge the same amount of money for a procedure, they'll do it all day. They can either see more patients or they can play more golf. It's up to them. But it's profitability, at least in my experience.
So I think, again, Vicki will have an interesting perspective, having worked both with a product that had both dental and orthopedic, major medical, where the focus on the one hand was more selling reimbursement and the other selling the value to individual practitioners, right?
Jeannie, one more comment on that?
Yeah.
I love being in dentistry because it's not so tied to reimbursement. I love the old model of you pay out the door. I mean, it's fantastic from a business perspective.
Yeah. Well, your value creation is between you and the customer.
There's still a transactional relationship between a patient and a dentist that does not exist in medicine. Nobody has any idea how much their MRI cost. Nobody. Everybody knows how much that root canal cost or that scaling procedure.
Yeah. But it does put additional pressure on you to demonstrate that you have.
Yeah,
added
pressure or
value.
opportunity.
Yeah, an opportunity.
Yeah, I look at it as an opportunity.
So
Thanks, Steve.
I would say where we started to make inroads is when, and this is in the orthopedic surgery world, when orthopedic surgeons realized they would be better surgeons with help of BMP2. So, for example, New England Baptist Hospital, which does a huge amount of spine surgery. I was there last year. They told me they spent $11 million last year buying BMP2, and they use it all the time because it gives them a 100% success rate where they might have had a 95% success rate. So it makes each surgeon look better. And to them, that's worth the cost.
So I would say I've heard oral surgeons say the same thing about using BMP, but it hasn't adopted as broadly, and there was not a reimbursement-driven motivation for oral surgeons. So it
Right.
was a different kind of
Right. So,
challenge there. Would you? Yeah. Okay.
so I think that's the other piece,
Right.
right? If you can enhance success,
Right.
and maybe that's shortening time, shortening rehab for the patient, whatever it is, that's considered valuable.
Yeah.
But the reimbursement part is
Yeah.
still the big hurdle.
Yeah, and there's another thing you said, though, Vicki. I want to just quickly expand on that a little bit in response to Will's question, which is that, the reimbursement model is a different driver, but the actual surgical procedures matter too. And what we're asking a biomaterial delivery system to do in these dental indications is quite different than in your spinal indication with the BMP, right? So they may have had a perfect carrier for orthopedics that was definitely not perfect for dental. So that's just another, you have to, and you guys I know are all very aware of that. We've talked a lot. Is it space making? What's it going to do when it gets a flap over top? If it dehisces, what about infection? You're in the mouth. I mean, there's just lots of other issues that come into play when you're in a oral environment, which make it more exciting, challenging, but they're real. So, Kevin.
Yeah, so we've been on an interview tour actually recently with some of the major pharma companies, AstraZeneca being one that I met with back in December. There's a number of companies that are also thinking about in this space, and we're thinking more on the pathology side of the concept of companion diagnostics, and whether or not that a slide that comes into our lab, if we could run an assay on it, and we run these at large scale, if it could be useful in predicting outcomes, let's say on immunotherapy or even surgery, and would actually make the clinician look better because they had information that they couldn't see at the time that gave them information that this was a better case for fit. I think one of the challenges for us has been that we are using things at large scale. So there's actually there's arms race to get all of the transcripts and all of the protein analyzed on one slide at the same time. But when you ask AstraZeneca, which I did, how many markers would you find appropriate if you're going to approach FDA as part of a kind of a standardized test that you're going to use, in, let's say, in cancer? And they said that they felt like they'd be asking for the moon if they asked for 6. And they thought that that same 6 also couldn't deviate across the body. The same 6 for oral, the same 6 for lung, the same 6 for GI, because they couldn't have 250 tests that might hit each type. And, I can maybe sit here and look foolish in 5 years, but I'm not sure that that's going to work. But I also understand the need to make it as minimal as possible for the outcomes. Now, so I actually then went to the oral pathologist because they're thinking of things, because they have to pay, they use stains sometimes to clarify some of their diagnostics. However, they typically do 1 or maybe 2, and it is also on the patient oftentimes to pay that back. And I asked them, would you even consider using an RNA test in combination with a protein test? 1 and 1, just 2 individual assays. And they told me even the difference in the modality would be different and challenging for the pathologist to comprehend and to actually pull into the workflow. When you're thinking about that downstream assay, we think RNA is perfect for looking at, let's say, interleukins, chemokines. Those are very challenging antibodies to make, to find. We now know that we may have an adoption issue on the pathology side for the diagnosis that might make, again, the precision outcome better. Yeah. And so when we try to make sure that we can design and go deeper and wider, we're oftentimes already thinking about what might the clinical adoption paradigm be, what's the minimal that we need to make the outcome, and can we make those match? And if I need 22, which currently we're using an antibody panel on one slide of 40 for perio, we can find all this interesting information. How much can I scale it down to where now we don't actually have to use all those 22 or 40. We can actually use 2 and everybody's kind of met at the table and they're happy. And that's, I think, our grand challenge in moving forward is what's possible in scaling, but also what's necessary for clinical adoption.
And that clinical adoption piece, I think we've all talked about a lot in this resource center. I mean, identifying those barriers as early as possible and engineering into your studies, your label, your commercial strategy, ways to navigate around those barriers. That's been something I know all of you have been thinking about. Lillian?
Good morning, everyone. I have a really naive question. I want to know about these figures called key opinion leaders. Who are they? What makes them KOLs? And what's the process of engaging them? Do you just call them up and have a casual conversation, or are they embedded with the technology? Are there conflicts of interest? And because they seem to be such enormous influences to think or float something, especially in the clinical adoption stage. And I just want to know more about that.
It's a great question. Who are these KOLs? And why do they wield so much power, or how do they do that? Steve, Jean, you want to start? We'll take that one?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
No, it's a great question. And as I was kind of thinking about this morning, I actually thought about this. So first of all, they're easy to find. They're obvious. They're the ones that can stand up at the Chicago Midwinter or the AAE if you're an endodontist and attract a crowd. And the reason people come and listen to them, speaking about podium support, is because they're interested in what they have to say. And they all know that there are some sponsorships involved, which are disclosed, so that's important. But I can tell you that, I'll tell you a story. When my first year with Tulsa Dental, we were at the Chicago Midwinter, and if you've ever been in the McCormick Center, it is just massive. And we were on the one side, and the McCormick Center thought it was a good idea to have a car show on the other side, which meant every single dentist in the world would rather go see cars than buy stuff from dental companies. So it was horrible. I'm like, we're getting our money back. We're never doing this again. I'm ranting and raving because we're just spent all this money and we're standing there by ourselves. We had sponsored, not sponsored, but we had worked with, I think it was either Cliff Ruddle or Steve Buchanan at the time. And they did a lecture on rotary endodontics, which was our product. When the dentists came out of that lecture, I turned a corner and looked at our booth from across the exhibit hall. And there was nobody anywhere, but they were 5 people deep at our booth. And that was my first lesson in the impact of KOLs in the dental industry. Everybody else was at the car show, or they were at our booth, and it was because of that lecture. Now, that said, you can't build your entire marketing strategy or sales strategy around it. And mainly the reason is if you've got all your eggs in one basket, it's not a great idea. So the thing that we did was we had some established kind of international KOLs. We actually built local KOLs. So we had an endodontist, George Just, here in Pittsburgh, and he would do lectures for us in Pittsburgh. So what it did was it expanded our KOL reach beyond the people who could fill a room at Chicago to doing them very locally. And the endodontists loved it because that gave them a chance to kind of brag about their abilities as an endodontist. It helped their referral base, and we liked it because they spoke about our products. So KOLs are absolutely critical, but you have to be careful not to have all your eggs in 2 or 3 baskets, because they can change. They can all of a sudden fall in love with somebody else. And if that's the case, then you're in a kind of a scramble mode. The other comment I was going to make about KOLs is obviously they're critical. But in your product development, as you're designing your products and you're thinking about where the market is, it's really, really good not to completely rely on your KOLs for that information, because they are a very, very, very small segment of the people who are actually going to buy your products. So when you're developing a technology, I think it's really important to listen very carefully to what the KOLs have to say, but also go and talk to regular specialists or general dentists, whoever you're going to market to, and make sure you're getting their perspective early in the development process. So you're not over-reliant on 3 or 4 very well-informed and very influential opinions, but you're talking to people who are actually going to use your product on a daily basis and be your market.
All right, thanks, Steve. I think Jean wanted to say something too.
I was going to answer that for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think that there are, and Steve, if you want, you can comment as well, but it comes down to your definition of a KOL. And I think there are 2 definitions, an A and a B. And A are the people, and there's some present in this room, who are academically and clinically accomplished, and they're published, they're researching, they're establishing science and driving the industry forward and bringing a lot of value to the table. There are also KOLs who are also very accomplished as individual practitioners, and they they're very good communicators, and they're able to translate what the product does or the procedure to the average clinician. And you tend to find that the A's, people in the A definition, tend to be more focused on specialists. Specialists like to hear and speak to those people. They're much more interested in the science and the history and the development. And general practitioners are much more interested in the D. They just want to know how to do it. And those are very broad definitions, and I'm not trying to be too, offend anyone with them. But I think it starts with the A's. You can't have a new technology, a new product without an A or several A's behind you who can talk and speak to and verify and validate what the product is and the science and technology behind it. Because if you don't have that, if you go straight to the B's, the A's will just shoot it in. Someone will ask them, they'll say, well, no, I can't support it. But the B's, some of them, look, honestly, they're very good showmen. They're very good educators. They're very good lecturers, and they do a good job. I think you find the A's in academia, or maybe highly successful practitioners who are closely tied to academia, and you know how to find them. They're published, the networks, and the B's, they will find you.
Yeah.
If they're good at what they do,
Yeah.
and if they can put 800 people in a room to talk about a product, they will come to you if they think you have a product that's worth them speaking to, and they will market themselves to you. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I'll add one more comment here, Lillian, which is I think if it's a truly new science and there's a large scientific shift in terms of what the practitioners are going to need to understand in order to use the product. Two examples would be osseointegration. When that was first introduced to the US, there was a small implant market, but there was nothing like the implant market we have today until they brought osseointegration here. That was led by scientists paired with clinicians. So you had a lot of science that had to be credible first before people would listen to the clinicians. And I think likewise for the early days of guided tissue regeneration, those workshops that were required, half the day was on the science with people who were publishing in serious, some of our leaders in the periodontal research profession at the time. And the other half was a clinician saying, this is how I use it in practice, and giving practical examples of the how-tos. So kind of the A-B paired. To bring a new technology, you need to design your KOL strategy. I mean, if you're just the new mousetrap, you might go to existing people who fill rooms already, fine, but people also kind of know when they're for sale, and it isn't as credible. But if you've got new science, you got to put together the right people to deliver the message in a really credible way and pair good science with good clinical opinion leaders, I think.
Yeah, and there's definitely a sequence to it.
Yeah.
You got to have the clinical credibility from the A group in Gene's terminology. And and a lot of it depends on what your technology or what your innovation is. If it's a completely different way to treat a disease like periodontitis, then you're going to need that academic credibility, because that's your foundation. That's published, studies, clinical studies, and everybody knows who those folks are. They're easy to find.
All right, thanks everybody, because I'm getting signals. We've got a program we need to move forward with. Thank you so much to our panelists. I think we could have spent more time here, and for all of you for engaging. Thanks. Have a good rest of the meeting.